Any questions? The best time for questions will be at the end. Okay, so this talk is about AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which is the new, well, it's not so new, but newish web technology for developing interactive web applications. And I'm going to be talking about essentially what it is, how it works, why there's a need for it, what does it offer over and above traditional web applications, and also you'll get to see some code. So you'll get to see the sort of code you'd have to write an AJAX application. And also I'm going to give you an example of a real-world AJAX application to show you an example of its applicability. Okay, so firstly, I'd like to minorly apologise that I'm not terribly au fait with using laptops, so if it takes some time for me to get from one page to the other, that's why. Okay, right, well, the first thing I'm going to do is just talk about how web applications in general work. So just to give you a bit of background as to how a typical website actually works. Now, most websites which interact with the user, most websites these days obviously do interact with the user. For example, if you're using a flight booking application, you would need to enter the details of the flight, and then the details of the flight would get sent over to a web server, which would then manipulate a database in some way. So most websites these days are interactive up to a point. They take information from a form. The user fills in information from a form, that gets sent over the web to a web server somewhere remotely, it might be in America or any part of the world, and then that web server manipulates a database in some way and sends the user back a response. And those sorts of interactive websites, which are pretty much the norm these days, there are practically no websites left these days which are just straight HTML, are known as web applications. So to give you an example of a few web applications, e-commerce sites such as flight booking, cinema booking, online searchable databases, things like Wikipedia, which is an example of an online searchable database, obviously with a wiki feature, which I believe one of the later talks will talk about in more detail. Any of those sorts of sites are web applications, because they interact with the user and they respond in some way. Okay. So how does the web application typically work? Well, I think that's best illustrated with a diagram. This will be the architecture of a so-called classic web application. So I've got the client. The client is essentially your PC, your box, whatever operating system you choose to use, whether it be Linux, whether it be Mac, whether it be something else. That's your box over there, and that's the client. Now, your box will be running a browser of some sort, such as Firefox or Opera, and your browser will be running on your box, and then the user will fill in information, typically in a form, as I said. That information gets sent across the web in something known as an HTTP request to a web server. The web server is essentially the remote computer running in California or Australia or Russia or wherever it might be running. And it receives the data that you've sent from your browser, and something known as a server-side script runs that data, processes that data. And a server-side script is essentially a program, or a small program, written in a language such as PHP or Perl or Ruby, running on a web server. It receives the data coming in from clients. It typically then passes it onto a database, because most websites these days interact with a database. Obviously, most websites handle data of some form or another. So most websites will interact with a database such as MySQL. And they might merely query the database, or they might update the database in some way. So your server-side script on your web server takes in the data from the user, interacts with the database, and then sends back a response. And the nature of the response is one of the key things relating to AJAX. Now, in a classic web application, as opposed to an AJAX web application, this response is a dynamically generated web page. It's a complete HTML web page. Complete HTML page with your head section, your CSS, everything else, the full web page. And it's dynamically generated by the server-side script, typically using data from the database. So your server-side script on the web server dynamically generates the page, that gets sent back to the client, and then the browser takes that dynamically generated page and reloads it. And that's why in a typical web application, when the user interacts with the web application in some way, like a form, the user might fill in information in the form, click go, and then you would see the page refresh. And that's happening because of this process. Data gets sent over to the server generates a new page gets sent back to the client, and then the browser reloads the page. So that's the architecture of a typical classic web application. And actually this slide, this set of slides, is an example of a classic web application. It's obviously running on a server. It's not using a database, it's actually using XML files, but in terms of the general architecture, what I'm showing you now, the slides, is a typical classic web application. So when we interact with the application in some way, such as click the next page, you'll see it reloads the browser with a new page. So what I've done just now is an example of that process I've just shown you on the last diagram, the only difference being there's no database involved. Okay, now these are all well and good. Obviously they're much better than just straight HTML websites with no form of interaction whatsoever, but there are problems. In particular, if you want to go for particularly interactive websites, now obviously with standard desktop applications interact straight away. So if you're talking about a desktop application such as OpenOffice or the GIMP or Microsoft Office for those of you from a Windows background, typical desktop applications interact straight away with the user. There's no waiting for the page to refresh. Your standard desktop application interacts straight away. And it would be nice if web applications could have the same instant interactivity as desktop applications. Because obviously it would then have the advantage that the application would run on a browser, so the user wouldn't have to download anything. They wouldn't have to download a specialised desktop application, but on the other hand, it would be as interactive as a desktop application. So it would essentially be nice if we could have web applications which have the same level of interactivity and instant feedback as desktop applications. And that's precisely where AJAX comes in. So AJAX is a new-ish, I should say newish, it's not brand new, but it's only recently that it's been publicised. AJAX is a newish approach to developing dynamic web applications. Now AJAX, it's an acronym. Obviously acronyms are extremely popular in the computing world, and it stands for Asynchronous, JavaScript and XML. And that should give you a clue as to what it's made up of. There's no such language as AJAX. AJAX isn't a language, rather it's a term, a buzzword, if you like, which relates to a combination of existing technologies. And essentially, as I was indicating, it allows client computers to communicate with a web server without having to reload the page. So AJAX allows you to develop responsive web applications. So essentially how it works is requests to the server are sent and responses received in the background. So the user doesn't have to submit a form or anything like that. The requests to the server go off in the background, and the responses are received in the background. And furthermore, while the client is waiting for the response to come back from the server, the user can still interact with the application. The application doesn't freeze while waiting for the response to come back from the server. And that's one of the key reasons why AJAX applications are much more interactive than web applications, than classic web applications, I should say. And that's where the word asynchronous comes in. Asynchronous essentially means that the web application doesn't stop running while waiting for the response to come back. Okay. Right, so as I said, it uses a combination of technologies. Now, JavaScript is one of the key components of AJAX. So just in case anyone isn't overly au fait with JavaScript, I just want to briefly talk about one or two JavaScript essentials. So AJAX does use JavaScript. Now JavaScript obviously is not a new technology. It's been around on the web practically since the year dot. And typical, if you think of websites going back to as early as 1995 or so, most websites these days have some form of basic interactivity. So most websites will validate a form, for example. So when the user fills in details in a form, before the details get sent across to the server, typically there's some sort of check to make sure that you filled in the right details in a form. And that's done through JavaScript. Other sort of special effects, such as rollovers. So most websites you see typically have a sidebar of hyperlinks, and those hyperlinks contain rollover effects of some sort. Those rollovers are often done with JavaScript. Similarly, things like drop-down menu systems, they are typically done with JavaScript. So if you've got a website where you get, say, you roll over some sort of menu bar and you see drop-down menus, typically JavaScript is used to sort of make those drop-down menus happen. So effects such as that, interactive effects, basic interactive effects on websites have been around since the year dot, really, using JavaScript. Okay. Now, in terms of how JavaScript works on a general sense, the key things about JavaScript are events and manipulating the web page. So JavaScript on a web page typically does two things. It responds to an event. And an event is essentially the user interacting with the web page. So an example of an event would be when the user clicks a button on the web page, or when the user moves the mouse over a hyperlink on the web page. So both of those are examples of events. An event is essentially any piece of interactivity or any instance of interactivity between the user and the page. And the typical way in which we write JavaScript is we write JavaScript to respond to those events. So when an event happens, such as the user clicking a button, then we can connect that event to some JavaScript, and then the JavaScript runs. So the other part of the equation is that JavaScript manipulates the page in some way. Examples of the JavaScript manipulating the page in some way would include, let's say, a drop-down menu appearing, or if you've got a rollover, if you've got a sidebar of hyperlinks and they change colour, again, an example of JavaScript manipulating the page in some way would be the JavaScript changing the background colour of that hyperlink. So that's just a bit of background, a bit of general background behind JavaScript, just in case you're not familiar. Okay, now I'm going to really talk about the guts of AJAX itself. Before I do so, does anyone have any misunderstandings relating to the background that I've talked about so far? No? Okay, let's carry on. Right, so diagram as to how AJAX works. So as I said, it's all about communicating with a web server without having to reload the page, without having to suspend interactivity between the user and the browser. So this is typically how it would work. The user interacts with the page in some way, so that's an event. Remember what I was talking about just now about events. So an event happens, some JavaScript runs to handle that event, and then the JavaScript sends off a request to the server. So a request is sent from the JavaScript to the server without having to reload the page on the client side. The server receives the request. On the server side, it's just a standard server-side script, nothing really different from a classic server-side script, because all the server-side script is doing is receiving a request and sending a response. So the server side of the equation is almost unchanged. It works in the same general way. It receives a request from the client, communicates with the database, and sends a response back. The real difference from the server point of view is it doesn't send back a whole web page. Instead, it just sends back data. So now that data can take the form of just plain text, or it can take the form of XML. And just in case you're unaware, XML is essentially a tag-based format to describe data. I'm not going to talk about XML in great detail here, but suffice to say, it's a format for representing data in which we structure the data using tags. So just to quickly write something up here, just a quick example of XML data. We might have something like CD, title, hogweed, close title, artist, Genesis, close artist, close CD. So just a slight ad hoc sort of writing of what XML would look like. We've got, just so you can see that it's got a tag, we've got essentially a series of tags representing the data. So it's just like HTML in that way. The data is structured using tags. Okay. So that's just an example of some simple XML representing information about a CD. Okay, that's really all you need to know about XML from the point of view of this talk. The key thing is, one advantage of AJAX, which is apparent, is that because we're only sending back data, the data will be much smaller than a web page. So we're only sending back pieces of data. Essentially, we're only sending back bits of data which represent what needs to be changed. So for one thing, the response from the server will be much smaller than if we were sending back a whole web page. So the server generates data, XML, or even just plain text. Just because the X in AJAX stands for XML, it doesn't mean that the data has to be XML. It typically is, but the data sent back can be just plain text. So the data gets sent back from the server to the client, and then JavaScript on the client receives the data and then manipulates the page with the data returned. So the JavaScript will receive the data and then will change the state of the page in some way to do something like, for example, replace the text in a paragraph. Okay. Right, so that's your basic mode of mechanism of AJAX. Now, I think at this point it's about the best time to do a demonstration of some real live AJAX. Now, those of you who were here in the meeting way back in June, I did talk about this site, FreeMap. It's essentially a free mapping site. It uses AJAX. So now, if I move on to one of these landscape features, go to Fun. Okay, there's that. Yeah, we'll come to that in a moment. So click on that hill. You can see that down there it comes up with information about the location. So if we go over a couple of things here, I should really turn these pop-ups off for this, but if we click on this, you can see that when we click on a location on the map, it comes up with information about the location at the bottom. And notice how we haven't had to reload the page. And furthermore, notice how if we roll the mouse over these places, we get information come up straight away like that. No, the pub doesn't have any information, but hopefully you can see that we've got interactivity here without having to reload the page. All we need to do, there are two modes of interaction. Click on a feature and the details about the feature will appear down here. And even just rolling the mouse over a feature will cause these pop-up windows to appear with information about the location. And that's all happening through AJAX. Whenever I roll over a feature and the mouse, whenever I keep the position of the mouse static for more than a couple of seconds, a request gets sent across to the server and then the server sends back data. So all this data is stored in a database, a MySQL database as it happens, on a server, and it just gets sent back to the client, and then the client manipulates the structure of the web page, makes this pop-up appear, and puts the data inside that division. So that is an example of a real-world AJAX application. Still somewhat in prototype state at the moment, it has to be said, but enough to demonstrate the use of AJAX. So hopefully you can see that it's an example of the sort of interactivity we can do with AJAX. Okay. Right, I've really already gone over all that, so I won't go over that again. The only thing maybe I will go over, actually, which I haven't really talked about much, is receiving the response. Now, as I said, with an AJAX application, we get data back from the server, and the data is used to change the state of the page in some way. Now, something called the document object model is used. How many of you have heard of the document object model? Pretty much all of you. But in case you haven't, it's an addressing system for page elements. It's a way in which we can get hold of elements on the web page from within JavaScript. And you'll see an example of some document object model code a bit later on. Right, talking of code, it's about time I showed you some code now. And here is, okay, that's the example. Here is an example of some code. So we're going to start with the code to send the request. So I've written a JavaScript function called send AJAX request. It takes in two parameters, x position and y position. They're the position of the mouse on the map. You can obtain mouse position using standard JavaScript functionality. So you can get the position of the mouse on a page element using classic JavaScript. Now, the first thing we do is we create an XML HTTP request object. Now that's an object in the object-oriented programming sense, which is used to represent the AJAX request and response. So we need to do two things, depending on whether we're dealing with a decent browser or whether we're dealing with Internet Explorer. So if it's something like Firefox or Mozilla, we create XML HTTP request. But if we're dealing with Internet Explorer, we have to make use of ActiveX. So that's a bit of feature detection. If we are dealing with Firefox, we create an XML HTTP request. It will work on Internet Explorer, but with Internet Explorer, we have to use ActiveX objects. Yeah?
At this point, if you use IE and you initialize this ActiveX object, will it come up with the warning saying that you are using ActiveX code?
If you've configured IE in that way, I would guess so, yeah. In terms of when I've tested AJAX on IE, I don't come up with that warning, but that could be just because the IE that I'm testing it on isn't configured in that way. Okay. Right, so having initialized our object, we just set up the URL of the server-side script we want to talk to. So in my example, that's just a standard PHP script. Nothing particularly magical about that. We then set up the data we want to send, and notice how we construct it in standard query string format. So it's just x equals our x position and y equals y position. We then open the connection. We set a header to indicate that we're essentially sending form data. Obviously it's not actually a form, but it's a post request which is in similar format to form data. Then we set something called the callback function. Now the callback function is the JavaScript that will run when we receive the response. In other words, what we're saying here is that when we receive the response from the server, the JavaScript function response received will run. Yeah?
Is this going to be available for us afterwards?
It's available on the web, yes. I'll put up the URL on the whiteboard at the end.
And there'll be a link from our wiki site as well.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got the callback function, and then we actually send the request. Now, as I said, it's asynchronous. The interaction between the user and the web page doesn't stop while we send that request off. The user can continue to interact with the web page, but when we get a response from the server, then this callback function will run. Okay. So I've already gone over that, so I think I can go straight on to the callback. So onto the callback function. This runs as soon as we get the response from the server. We need to check that the response was successful. If there was some sort of network error, this ready state property will give us a different value other than 4. So if the response was received successfully, what I've done here is just call another function. Now, the key thing I want to talk about here is that the XML HTTP object, which if you remember is the object representing the AJAX communication, has a couple of properties. And those properties are useful to us if we want to do anything with the response. There are two properties. There's response text, which I'm using here. Response text is simply the response as text. So that's simply the text of the response sent back from the server, which is the most simple property to work with. In fact, it's very simple to work with. The other property, which is useful if we're getting XML back from the server, is response XML. And response XML is a document object model node hierarchy which we can navigate if we want to do clever things with the XML returned from the server. So if the server sent us back XML, then response XML is essentially a complex data structure representing the XML returned back from the server. So if we want to do things like only get certain information out of the response, then we can take the response XML property and manipulate it. So those of you who are familiar with document object model programming, response XML is essentially a document object model hierarchy of nodes. Okay. Right, so on to actually manipulating the page. Now I've got our data back. Again, for simplicity, I've just shown you a very simple example. So change text is our function. If we remember, change text, if we go back to the previous slide, if you remember, we're passing in the response text into the change text function. So if we go to change text, text, our parameter is the text which was returned from the server. So all we're doing here in this very simple example is something extremely simple. We're using the DOM, the document object model, to get hold of a particular element on the page. Now imagine we've got a page division. Are you all familiar with the idea? Anyone not familiar with the idea of divs or page divisions? No? Essentially, a div, a page division, in case anyone isn't, is if you're writing HTML and we want to lay out the page, each section of the page, each block of the page is a div or a page division. So a div is essentially a block on a page which we can use to contain arbitrary content. So a typical page with, let's say, a sidebar and a main content area. The sidebar would be one div and the main content area would be another div. Right, so our div has got an ID of info window. So what we do in our JavaScript is we use the document object model to get hold of the div with the ID of info window, and then we manipulate the contents of the div. So we're saying info window dot first child dot node value equals text. And what that will do, assuming the div has only got text within it, that will replace the text of the div with the text we got back from the server. So as I said, this is just a very simple example to illustrate the point. This example will only work if the div contains plain text. It won't work if the div contains other page elements such as headings and paragraphs. If the div contained other page elements, we would have to use document object model functions to access the individual elements within the div and replace the text within them. So this is just a very simple example to illustrate the point. Okay. Right. Okay. Right, so that's really a basic AJAX, basic piece of AJAX code. That's really, those three scripts are really all you need, or those three JavaScript functions are really all you need to develop an AJAX application. At its most basic level, there's nothing that complicated about it. If you're at all competent in basic programming, then you can do it. Right. Okay, AJAX does have a few problems. It's nice, but there are a few problems. It's not supported by all browsers. It works reliably on Firefox and Internet Explorer. And it's partly working on Opera, For example, my free map site sort of half works in Opera, but it's a bit wobbly. So the key thing to remember is that AJAX is not supported by all browsers. So if your AJAX functionality is crucial or critical to the functioning of the site, then really you need to provide an alternative for non-supported browsers. Okay. So a good approach is to provide a JavaScript free version for non-supported browsers. In other words, have your flashy AJAX version of your website for AJAX compliant browsers, but then just have a basic classic web application for those browsers that do not support AJAX, so that everyone can take advantage of your site to some degree. Second related disadvantage, which is really related to the first, is the general issue of accessibility. The interactive nature of AJAX applications is not suited to screen readers. In other words, if you try to put an AJAX application through a screen reader, the screen reader wouldn't be able to make much sense of it. So again, so that you can support screen readers, provide a basic version of your site. Yep.
I'm familiar with the term screen reader.
Okay, sorry, screen reader. Yeah, a screen reader is a special piece of software to allow blind people to hear the content of web pages. So what it does is it reads in a web page and it speaks the contents. So because screen readers don't support cutting-edge JavaScript very well, they wouldn't make much sense of an AJAX application. Okay, a third point, which is slightly less of a critical disadvantage as the first two, is that because the page is never reloaded, the back button doesn't undo the user's last action. So if you click back on a AJAX application, it wouldn't undo the user's last action. But I'd like to throw a bone of contention about this because an AJAX's remit is to simulate standalone applications in a browser, one has got to ask the question, is the back button really appropriate? If the user was interacting with an AJAX application, would they actually think to click back to do the last thing? Or would they see the AJAX application as essentially a full standalone application running in a web browser? So the first 2 points are what I would call thoroughly valid disadvantages, which you should try and find ways around, whereas the third one is slightly more a bone of contention. Right. Okay, and lastly, future directions. So obviously, as AJAX takes off in terms of popularity, more and more responsive web applications are occurring. Google Maps is one of the best known examples. Gmail, the Google Mail application, is another one. A possible interesting future trend could be the combination of AJAX and something called scalable vector graphics. Now, scalable vector graphics is an XML-based graphics format with advanced features such as animation and interactivity. In other words, scalable vector graphics is kind of similar in its remit to Flash, but the difference is it's standards compliant, it's controlled by the W3C as opposed to Macromedia, and it uses XML. So if you're familiar with developing with XML, then developing SVG, you can use a lot of the XML development principles when developing SVG. So scalable vector graphics essentially is a format, an XML-based format for interactive graphics, and it uses JavaScript to add things like animation and interactivity. So for example, you can do things like animate features, animate images, and even do things like simple games using scalable vector graphics. Now, one possible feature trend with AJAX, which would be quite nice, is to combine scalable vector graphics and AJAX. Because JavaScript and XML are common to both AJAX and SVG, they lend themselves to sort of integrating with each other quite nicely. Because what you could do with AJAX, you could have XML coming back from the server to the browser. The browser could display an SVG image. Now, JavaScript running in the browser could receive the XML coming back from the server, and then using something called XSLT, which is a language for transforming one XML format to another, it could transform the XML returned back from the server into SVG and then display that SVG in the browser. And then further JavaScript later on could then receive user events on the SVG and then send another request back off to the server. So because AJAX and SVG both have JavaScript and XML in common, the two technologies, I feel personally, lend themselves to combination very nicely. And if I get the time, obviously time is quite a premium with me at the moment, but if I get the time, I would like to, with my free map application, combine those two to develop and take it to the next level.